So Germany has decided to buy Tomahawk missiles, cruise missiles from the US. There's a particular amount of fear attached in Russia towards German rearmament in particular. Germany is saying we're back, you can rely on us as a partner. So Germany has decided to buy Tomahawk missiles, cruise missiles from the US because originally the idea was that the US would station those on German soil and therefore it would cost Germany nothing, but they'd still be able to use the basically deterrence value that they bring. And then Donald Trump basically cancelled that deal, and it was now decided that Germany should just buy them and use them themselves. And there's an added basically dimension in that they now have to decide how to incorporate them into their own defense strategy and how to use them and when to use them. So this is a quite a big deal in the sense that Germany now has added kind of a new dimension to its own defense capability and has to deal with that strategically rather than relying on the US to make those kinds of decisions. This move to buy sort of cruise missiles with that sort of range. I mean, Germany has got its own, the Taurus missiles as well, but they're not as long-ranging as these ones. So this is really quite a new dimension to what they're doing. And it's part of a wider sort of really a sea change, I would say, in the way that Germany sees its own military capability and its own role in the defense of Europe. Since the war in Ukraine, there's been a kind of really a big change in the way that Germany sees itself there. This was called the Zeitenwende, or the turning point, by Olaf Scholz, the previous German chancellor at the time. And this is now really coming to the fore, so lots more money is being spent. The first ever defense strategy has just come out that Germany's had really since the Second World War. That's how big this kind of ideological change is. And it's also a move from the US side to hand over more responsibility to Europe itself to defend the continent rather than the US doing it. And this latest move is part of that. I think Germany sees this less as a comeback because, of course, it's uneasy about its own past and it doesn't want to say, we're back. But equally, those are the words that Chancellor Friedrich Merz used. I think this was more of an allusion to the Cold War, when West Germany was seen as a really strong part of the sort of bulwark against communism. So what they're saying to the Americans and other allies is, you can rely on us again as you were able to during the Cold War rather than the Second World War. So it's always complicated with Germany's military history, which part is okay to draw kind of long lines of continuity from and which are definitely not. And so, in the times when West Germany spends sort of 3-4% of its GDP and more at times during the Cold War, that's sort of what they're saying to people is we're back, we're reliable, you can depend on us, rather than the times under Angela Merkel in particular, when military spending went to around 1% of GDP, so well under the 2% NATO target, and there was largely a reliance on the US to do all of the things that Germany should be doing itself. So in that sense, Germany is saying we're back. You can rely on us as a partner, but not as far as they're kind of back to the military threat that they posed to Europe twice in the 20th century. The ordinary German public, I think they're largely on board with the idea that the German military hasn't seen enough spending in recent years, because there were really embarrassing headlines in previous years and decades, for instance, where German soldiers were forced to practice with broomsticks rather than real rifles because there just wasn't enough equipment there, or there were headlines that they didn't even have enough warm underwear when they were sitting there in the Nordics defending the eastern flank of the NATO territory. So people are keen to avoid that, and I think so most people are okay with the idea of spending more on German defense. What they're less agreed on is what that actually means for them personally. So we've already seen protests, for example, from school students who say that they're just not going to sign up if the government tries to force them to be sort of registered for potential future military service. Then they will just simply refuse. We've had sort of demonstrations about that already, especially in the former East Germany. There's a really quite a strong streak of anti-militarism. Most people see it as a form of a kind of pacifism. That is something that they have to reckon with. So people are saying, why are you spending this money on the military when you could be spending it on schools? That sort of old debate that we see in other countries as well, but there's a strong kind of regional dimension to that in Germany between East and West. So there are all sorts of hurdles, I think, and they need to invest more time and thought into how to get the entire population to sign up to this rather than just saying we're going to spend the money on it. The other big question is whether or not the neighbours of Germany's neighbours are happy with this or not, particularly Poland and other countries to the east that were, of course, invaded brutally by Nazi Germany and have not forgotten this. So there are still, for example, reparations claims for the Second World War in Poland to the tune of trillions, I think. So this isn't something that will be easily brushed aside. And we've seen efforts from German politicians to try and basically talk to the militaries and also to the politicians of other countries to find a kind of cultural way of dealing with that. Because on the flip side, of course, countries like Poland, which are closer to Russia, want German support in the defense. But equally, it has to be done very cautiously, I think, so that old and painful memories don't stand in the way of these countries working together with Germany. I think it's a bit easier with Western European states because they've been in the European Union together for much longer. And there's also been a much more concerted effort, for example, with France towards reconciliation. So yes, you also still get World War II memories there. But I think there's also a long period of post-war relations between West Germany and France and also Britain. Whereas with the Eastern European nations, that's a newer relationship because of the Cold War. And it's also one that's incredibly painful because of the nature of warfare in the East compared to the West during the Second World War. So it's something that is quite delicate and has to be handled carefully. There's a figure that you often see, 2029, that is being used as the potential date when Russia may be ready to invade a NATO country, and so Germany is trying to prepare for that, and there are various wargaming scenarios going on where they test, for example, what happens if they invade in Poland or in the Baltics, and how Germany should respond to that in conjunction with its other NATO allies. So that figure is being used, and the idea is that the German military should be in a state to defend or to help defend the NATO states by then. The more realistic figure that you also often see is sort of mid-30s, the mid-2030s, when Germany will have achieved its targets in terms of personnel and also weaponry, because ultimately these procurement programs take a while. You can order, say, missiles or whatever, but they have to actually be made, they have to be stationed, people have to be trained to use them, they have to be incorporated into the military strategy. So that figure, I think, is being used to inject also a bit of urgency into this process so that it's not, as is often the case in Germany, it doesn't kind of take forever with the bureaucracy to go through all of that. But ultimately, if you're signing kind of new personnel up now in order to increase the military size, people aren't going to be ready within 1 or 2 years. They need to be, thoroughly and properly trained, and so that will take a little while longer. But that figure is certainly the target, 2029. I think Putin will see the acquisition of the Tomahawk missiles as an added provocation, because there's already a lot of sensitivity around Germany in particular rearming. I mean, this triggers memories in Russia too. They were ultimately, when they were the Soviet Union, invaded by Nazi Germany in 1941. They hadn't seen it coming because Stalin wasn't really prepared for that, and it was a huge national effort and a lot of sacrifice when you think over 20 million Soviet soldiers died in the Second World War. This was really quite an existential war for them as well because of the Nazis' genocidal policies in the East. So that triggers all sorts of memories. So what you normally see is every time that Germany goes another step towards rearmament, and this is a significant step, you usually see them coming out with kind of Nazi type rhetoric. So they will say something like, oh, Nazi Germany is back. Or, now you see German soldiers once again, fighting Russian soldiers, and this reminds them of the Second World War as well, particularly Putin, whose family fought in the Second World War. So when you think about his age as well, there's a direct dimension there where he has almost like lived memories of it, not himself, but through his family. And this is an important dimension, I think, that we mustn't forget, is that this immediately triggers things in Russia that it wouldn't say if it was France or Britain doing it. I think there's quite a powerful dimension in that memory in Russia too, in the sense that they do respond quite strongly and emotionally to Germany specifically rearming, so that there's fear involved with that, and that can be quite a strong, I think, element of deterrence because of this memory and the generational trauma that the Second World War has caused. I don't think Germany should play on that deliberately because of obviously its own past and that not being an appropriate thing to do. But nonetheless, they should know that there's a particular amount of fear attached in Russia towards German rearmament in particular. And the other thing we mustn't forget is that Germany is the largest economy in Europe, and despite its economic problems, also still the third largest economy in the world. So there's significant economic power behind this too. And Germany has got the industry, the arms industry, as well as the capacity to build things and the economic need, frankly, to carry on having an industry in Germany, even as the car industry is declining. So there are lots of opportunities here, I think, for both Germany and Europe to make this work. It's just that they have to take culture and society along with this huge spending change, because ultimately they're going to rely on people to carry this change in direction and to go along with it. Well, an interesting dimension with this is what the AfD, Germany's far-right party, are going to do with all of this. They're actually internally arguing over military spending and over remilitarization in general. A lot of them are happy with the strong German army because they see it as part of the national project. They think it's a good thing if young men have got to go through a period of national service. But on the flip side, they're very pro-Russian in lots of ways, and they don't want Germany to support Ukraine in the way that it currently does. So there's a sort of argument there. Yes, we want a stronger military, but not used in the way that the current government wants to use it. And since the AfD are currently the strongest party in the polls by quite some margin as well, they're on something like 28, 29% in most of the polls, so 4-5% ahead of the conservative CDU that is currently running the country. There's a very realistic chance that they might come into government, and certainly in regional governments, and then potentially even going forward having some say at the national level. And if that's the case, then this entire strategy long term is going to be under a lot of questions from them, because they will want to see the military used in a very different way, and they're a lot more pro-Russian. So the current German military strategy actually identifies Russia as the main not outright enemy, but the main threat to Germany. And that's something that the AfD feel very different about. They say outright Russia's not a threat. They want to work with us. If we can find a way of going back to importing energy from them, then we can sort of be partners rather than enemies. And that's a very, very different approach from the current government, which sees Russia as the main threat to itself and to Europe.